Now, of course, if consciousness is produced by the brain, then when the brain dies, consciousness ends. It cannot continue into another incarnation. So if some of us do remember our past lives, then those memories cannot reside solely in the brain. The final phenomenon I want to discuss with you are these cases that my mentor Ian Stevenson investigated of very young children who claim to remember their past lives. The majority of these children live in societies that have some cultural belief in rebirth, and a great many of those live here in India. To study these children, Stevenson traveled many times to remote villages throughout India to interview these children and their families. Our group at the University of Virginia has studied more than 2,400 cases of these very young children who spontaneously start talking about their past life. About half of these children live in Asia, most of them in India, Burma, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. They usually begin speaking about these past life memories between the ages of 2 and 5 years. And in most cases, those memories tend to fade between the ages of 6 and 9 years. The child gives enough detailed information that we can identify the past life in 60% of these cases. The average age of death in the past life is 33 years, but that varies from country to country. In places like the United States and Europe, where there is less violence in the culture and healthcare is more available, the age tends to be higher. In 60% of cases, the past life remembered ended violently, either in a tragic accident or by intentional wounding. The average time that passes between the death in the past life and the birth in the present life is 12 years. But that too varies in keeping with cultural beliefs. For example, among the Druze in Lebanon, the children tend to be born immediately upon the death of the past life, which is in keeping with their cultural belief. As you might expect, these cases are not easy to investigate. This is a picture of Ian Stevenson interviewing a young girl and her parents in an Indian village with an interpreter sitting next to him. These children often live in remote villages that are hard to reach, and they often require Western researchers to interview the children through a translator. There are several features of these cases that challenge the assumption that all our thoughts and memories are produced by the brain. First, these children often have detailed and specific memories that correspond to the life of someone who had lived and died in a distant location, of whom they could have had no knowledge by normal means. They will mention the names and occupations of relatives and friends from the past life, and often the specific details of how that past life ended. In many cases, we can take the child to the remote village where he or she claimed to have lived previously, and the child is able to identify people and places he had never seen before in this life. Second, these children sometimes exhibit unusual personality traits, likes and dislikes, that are incompatible with their present lives. For example, some of these children recall a past life of the opposite gender, and they want to dress and play like someone of the opposite gender. A child born to a Hindu family may recall a past life as a Muslim, and he will reject the food his mother cooks because it was not prepared in the Muslim manner. Several young Burmese children claim to remember lives as Japanese pilots who were shot down over Burma in World War II. They rejected the spicy Burmese food and requested Japanese cuisine such as raw fish. And they rejected the traditional Burmese clothes and wanted pants like the Japanese wore. Many children who recall past lives have fears that they relate to their past lives. For example, a child who recalls having been drowned in a well may have an unusual fear of water. Finally, third, some of these children exhibit unusual skills that they have not been taught, and indeed that no one in their village knows. For example, a child may be able to play a musical instrument without being taught, or may have skills related to their occupation in the past life. We have studied children in Sri Lanka, in villages where only the Tamil language is spoken, and yet the child can converse in Sinhalese. Finally, some of these children have very unusual and unexplained birthmarks or birth defects that they attribute to their death in a past life. These birthmarks and birth defects that are said to correspond to the death wounds in the past life occur in about 1/3 of the children we have investigated. Sometimes the birthmarks fade as the child grows up, but in other cases they do not. And of course, birth defects persist throughout the life of the child. In 18% of these cases, we can confirm through medical records or autopsy reports that the death wounds from the past life do indeed correspond to the birthmarks or birth defects in the present child. Let me give you a few short examples of these unusual birth defects. These are the hands of Mien Thein, a Burmese girl born in 1956. She remembered the life of a man who was riding home on his bicycle when he was stopped by a gang who had been hired to kill him. They made him get down on his knees and prepare to cut his head off with a sword. At the last moment of his life, as he was on his knees facing the swordsman, he suddenly raised his hands to plead for mercy, or maybe to protect his face from the sword. And the fingertips on both his hands were cut off by the sword. As a child, this girl, Mien Thein, insisted on wearing boys' clothes and referred to her actions with masculine verb forms. These are the hands of Lekpal, an Indian boy born in Uttar Pradesh. He remembered the life of another boy named Hukum Singh, who lived in a distant village, who, when he was only 3 years old, got his right hand caught in an automatic fodder chopping machine, and he lost fingers of just that one hand. When Lekpal was eventually taken to the village where Hukum Singh had lived in the past life, he identified the correct location where the accident had taken place, and he also correctly identified the man who was operating the fodder chopper machine when the 3-year-old Hukum Singh had caught his fingers in. This is the back head of a little girl named Jacinta Agbo, born in Nigeria. She was born with this unexplained 3-centimeter wide birthmark that goes completely around her head. There is no physiological mechanism that can explain a birthmark of this type. She remembered the life of a man who had been hit on the head with a club during a quarrel 10 years before she was born. And the man had surgery to drain the blood from his head and reconstruct the broken skull bones. This photo was taken when she was 2 years old. When we interviewed her several years later, she showed definite masculine traits and habits. Although many of the strongest cases of children who remember past lives come from cultures where there is a belief in rebirth, we also have some very impressive cases from Christian families in the United States in which there is no prior knowledge of rebirth and certainly no interest or belief in it. This is a 2-year-old boy named James Leininger, who was born in Louisiana, who seemed to remember being shot down over the Pacific Ocean in World War II, nearly 60 years earlier. The boy would often play with airplanes and wake up screaming from nightmares about being trapped in an airplane that was on fire. When he was 3 years old, his mother bought him a toy airplane and pointed out what she thought were bombs under the wings. But little James corrected her, saying that those weren't bombs, they were drop tanks, something she had never heard of. He eventually gave many more details of his past life, saying that he flew an airplane called a Corsair that used to get flat tires frequently, something that military historians confirm is often true of Corsairs. He also gave the name of the aircraft carrier he flew from as the Natoma, and he said that he was killed flying over Iwo Jima, and that his best friend was another pilot named Jack Larson. Now, little James's father was a policeman and a devout Christian, a Baptist, who was quite opposed to the idea of rebirth. He researched this story, trying to discredit it. Instead, he found that there was an aircraft carrier called the Natoma Bay at the Battle of Iwo Jima in 1945, and that only one American pilot was shot down in that battle, a man named James Houston, when his Corsair airplane was shot down and caught on fire. This is the 21-year-old James Houston in his Corsair airplane shortly before the Battle of Iwo Jima. Little boy James Leininger's parents tried to find this pilot's family. They eventually found his sister, who lived in California nearly 3,000 miles away. And here's a little boy with the person he claimed to be his sister in the past life. She confirmed that her dead brother, James Houston, did have a friend named Jack Larson. And the little boy spontaneously identified several objects in her home that had belonged to her dead brother. She is convinced that this little boy is indeed the rebirth of her brother. So in summary, there is abundant evidence from life and from scientific research that the brain, under extraordinary circumstances, seems to come unlinked from consciousness. And consciousness can, in fact, function better without the mediation of the physical brain. Again, I want to say that this evidence is not accepted by most American scientists. In fact, is not known by most American scientists. Nevertheless, it is there, and it is reliable and reproducible evidence. We have cases of people whose brain have been deteriorating for years who suddenly think clearly on their deathbeds. We have people who function normally, sometimes with high intelligence, who have virtually no brain tissue. We have people who during near-death experiences, think more clearly than ever when their brains are not functioning. And we have very young children who can barely speak, who talk about their past lives with accurate details. These phenomena, all well investigated by modern scientific methodologies, and building upon decades or centuries of prior research, strongly suggest that under extraordinary circumstances, consciousness can be produced and can function without the intercession of a physical brain. Thank you.